Timothy was born in South Wales in the town of Merthyr Tydfil, on November 20, 1924. His father Daniel abandoned the family in April 1924, before Evans's birth. He had an older sister Eileen, and a younger half-sister Maureen. And his mother remarried in September of 1933. Timothy had a difficult childhood, and he struggled with learning how to read, speak and write. At the age of 8, he was in an accident that resulted in him suffering from a skin condition on his right foot, that never fully healed. Due to this, he missed a lot of time from school as he had to make regular trips to the hospital for his treatment. And his incomplete education resulted in him being unable to read lengthy documents and important information, and he relied on others to read them out to him. Although he was able to read small and simple passages such as in comics, newspaper football reports and on his wage receipts. It seems that his illiteracy led to a feeling of inadequacy, because Timothy would become prone to inventing stories about himself and his life in an apparent attempt to boost his self-esteem, a trait that continued into adulthood. People who knew him were keenly aware of his penchant for tall tales. This trait of Timothy's interfered with his efforts to establish credibility, especially when dealing with the police and courts. Timothy's IQ was tested in 1949, and he was found to have a score of 65 to 75, which would have placed him in the low to below average category today. Back in the 40s, he would have been openly ridiculed for his low IQ. Timothy was known throughout his life to switch between a thick Welsh accent and a Cockney accent, depending on whom he was speaking to. In 1935, his mother and her second husband moved the family to London, where Timothy continued to attend school, while working as a painter and decorator. He didn't like living in London, and after a few years, he returned to Wales in 1937. He then briefly worked in the coal mines there, but had to resign because of continuing problems with his foot. In 1939, he was forced to return to London to live again with his mother. And in 1946, they moved to St. Mark's Road, Notting Hill. Timothy was for the most part a pretty stand-up citizen. His only run-in with the law was when he was fined 60 shillings at the West London Magistrates' Court, for stealing a car and driving without a license or insurance. In January of 1947, Timothy met Beryl Susanna Thorley on a blind date. Just 9 months later, the two went on to get married. The couple initially lived with Timothy's family at St. Mark's Road, but when Beryl got pregnant in early 1948, they moved into the top-floor flat at 10 Rillington Place, in the Ladbroke Grove area of Notting Hill, which was only a 2-minute walk from St. Mark's Road. On October 10, 1948, Beryl gave birth to their daughter, Geraldine Evans. And she was not exactly born into a happy family. It wasn't an easy marriage, as Beryl was only 19, and Timothy was in his early 20s, and they were known to argue constantly. Occasionally, arguments turned into physical fights which were witnessed by their neighbors sometimes. Money was one of the main causes of tension between them, as Beryl was known to be bad at managing finances, and Timothy was known to spend heavily on his drinking, which further exacerbated their relationship. In late 1949, when Beryl found out that she was pregnant again, the couple were distraught. Since the family was already struggling financially, Beryl decided to have an abortion. And since abortion was still illegal in the UK at the time, women would resort to going to backstreet doctors for help. And it was especially dangerous, as the death rate from these backstreet abortions was twice the maternal mortality rate. Unwilling to take the risk, Timothy was initially against the idea of an abortion, but seeing as they had no other option, he reluctantly agreed. Several weeks later, on November 30, 1949, Evans showed up at the Merthyr Tydfil police station in Wales. He informed them that his wife had died under unusual circumstances. He said he'd given her some mixture in a bottle that was provided to him by a man in the street, in an attempt to induce an abortion. She died as a result of drinking this mixture, and he had disposed of her body by putting it in a drain outside the front of his flat at 10 Rillington Place in London. He said that he then arranged for someone to look after Geraldine, before heading back to Wales. The police took this seriously, and they searched the drain outside the front of the building and found nothing. And they discovered that the manhole cover was incredibly heavy, and needed the combined strength of 3 officers to remove it. They concluded that a single man could not have lifted the manhole cover by himself and disposed of the body. So Timothy was questioned once again, and this time he changed his story. He said that it was actually his downstairs neighbor John Christie, who offered to perform an abortion on Beryl. Timothy said he didn't want to mention Christie before because he didn't want him to get into any trouble. But unknown to Timothy and the police at the time, John Christie was actually a serial killer who murdered at least 8 people, strangling them to death in his own flat at 10 Rillington Place. When Christie offered to perform the abortion on Beryl, the couple weren't sure about it at first, but after some deliberation, they took him up on his offer. On November 8, Timothy went to work for the day as usual, while Beryl headed down to Christie's flat to get the abortion. When Timothy returned home that evening, Christie informed him that the abortion had not gone as planned, and that Beryl had died. Christie said that he would dispose of the body down the drain, and that he would arrange for a couple he knew from East Acton to look after Geraldine while Timothy laid low. On November 14, Timothy left for Wales to stay with his relatives. He said he later returned to 10 Rillington Place to ask about Geraldine, but Christie had refused to let him see her. Overcome by guilt, Timothy decided to turn himself in and went to the police in Merthyr Tydfil. A second search was conducted at 10 Rillington Place, and this time, the police did end up finding Beryl's body, wrapped in a tablecloth in the washhouse in the back garden. Access to the locked washhouse was only possible by using a knife kept by Mrs. Christie. Shockingly, the body of little Geraldine was also found alongside Beryl's body. Timothy had not mentioned he had killed his daughter in either of his statements. Beryl and Geraldine had both been strangled, and Beryl had been physically assaulted before her death. When the police turned to Timothy for answers, he was questioned multiple times. Eventually, when he was asked if he killed his wife and child, he replied yes, before providing a full confession. This was a man who had a terribly low IQ, a man who could barely read, and someone who was known to exaggerate and make up stories about himself. Timothy later stated in court that he thought he would be subjected to violence by the police if he did not confess, and this fear along with the shock of discovering that both his wife and daughter had been strangled, likely induced him to make a false confession. The police investigation was marred by a lack of forensic expertise, with significant evidence overlooked. It was also later revealed that Timothy had very little information about the ongoing investigation, and much of his confession was dictated to him by the investigators, and there was zero forensic evidence to point towards Timothy being guilty at all. For someone who could barely read or write, Timothy had given a suspiciously well-written confession. It stated that he strangled Beryl during an argument over money and the unborn baby, and he hid her body in the washhouse on November 8. It also stated that he murdered his daughter 2 days later. On January 11, 1950, Timothy Evans was put on trial only for the murder of his daughter and not his wife Beryl. This was in accordance with the law at the time, which stated they could only proceed with a single charge of murder. Technically, he was still charged for the murder of Beryl, but was not tried for it. The prosecution used Beryl's murder in order to establish Timothy's guilt in court for Geraldine's murder. At trial, Timothy withdrew his confession, and claimed that John Christie had killed his wife and daughter. But John Christie wasn't even considered to be a suspect in this case despite several previous run-ins with the law, including for violence. In fact, John Christie was made a key witness for the prosecution. Christie obviously denied all allegations made against him by Timothy, including having offered to perform the abortion on Beryl, and also went on to give detailed evidence about the quarrels between Timothy and Beryl. The defense tried to prove that Christie was the murderer, highlighting all of his past violence, but apparently his reform and his service with the police as a special constable may have impressed the jury. Additionally, according to the prosecution, Christie apparently had zero motive to kill the wife and child, unlike Timothy, who was in an unhappy marriage and did not want a second child. The prosecution used Timothy's habit of fibbing and exaggerating things against him, and they said that the way he changed his statements multiple times was telling of his intention to hide the truth. Eventually, it all came down to Christie's word against Timothy's, and the course of the trial quickly turned against Timothy. The trial lasted only 3 days, and much key evidence was omitted, or never shown to the jury. One of the more vital pieces of evidence that was omitted was that two workmen wanted to testify in court to say that there were no bodies in the wash house, when they came to do some work there several days after Timothy supposedly hid them. If there were bodies there, they would have noticed them. Their evidence in itself would have raised doubts about the veracity of Timothy's alleged confessions, but the workmen were not called to give evidence. Indeed, the police re-interviewed the workmen, and forced them to change their evidence to fit the preconceived idea that Timothy was the sole murderer. The murderer, Christie, would have hidden the bodies of Beryl and Geraldine in the temporarily vacant first-floor flat, and then moved them to the wash house 4 days later when the workmen had finished. After just 3 days, Timothy was found guilty. The jury took just 40 minutes to come to its decision. They returned a guilty verdict and sentenced him to death. The defense appealed, but it was quickly denied. And so on the 9th of March, 1950, at Pentonville Prison, Timothy Evans was hanged to death. 3 years after Timothy Evans' execution, John Christie vacated his flat at 10 Rillington Place, and the landlord allowed an upstairs tenant, Beresford Brown, to use Christie's kitchen. To his horror, Brown discovered the bodies of 3 women hidden behind the wallpaper in the kitchen pantry, which was immediately next to the wash house where Beryl and Geraldine Evans' bodies were found. Brown called the police and a search for John Christie immediately began. Christie was arrested on March 31, 1953, on the embankment near Putney Bridge. During the course of his interrogation, Christie confessed 4 separate times to killing Beryl Evans. He never admitted to killing Geraldine Evans, however. After searching his house thoroughly, they discovered more bodies in the front room and in the garden. They even found a human thigh bone which was used to prop up one of the fence posts. In total, he confessed to have killed 8 women. Christie was found guilty of murdering his wife, and was hanged on July 15, 1953 by Albert Pierre Point, the same hangman who had executed Evans 3 years prior. Of course, Christie's conviction raised some obvious doubts about Timothy's guilt in the murder of his wife and child. The serving Home Secretary at the time commissioned an inquiry to investigate the possibility of a miscarriage of justice. Surprisingly, the inquiry's findings upheld Timothy's guilt in both murders, saying that Christie's confessions of murdering Beryl Evans were unreliable. Skeptics challenged this conclusion by asking, if Christie's confessions were unreliable, why should those of Timothy's be acceptable? In 1955, editors from 4 well-known papers formed a delegation to petition the Home Secretary for a new inquiry, because they found the previous one dissatisfactory. However, the controversy surrounding Timothy's guilt would last well into the 60s. A new inquiry in 1965 found that it was more probable than not that Timothy murdered his wife but not his daughter. This was contrary to the prosecution's case, which said that both murders had been committed by the same person as a single act. Since Timothy was only tried for the murder of his daughter and not his wife, this new finding meant that Timothy can finally be exonerated. Because of the mishandling of the case and the subsequent biased inquiry, the acting Home Secretary recommended a royal pardon for Evans, which was granted in October of 1966. Timothy's remains were finally moved from the prison walls, and he was reburied at St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Cemetery in Leytonstone, Greater London. Technically, Beryl and Geraldine's murders remain unsolved to this day, but it is agreed that John Christie was most likely the killer. The outcry over the Evans case, where seemingly an innocent man was put to death for no reason, was one of the main contributors for the suspension, and then abolition of capital punishment in the United Kingdom. The general public were vocal about their displeasure over the death penalty, and the wrongful execution of Timothy Evans was the last straw. What are your thoughts on this case? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and we hope you found our video interesting. Like, comment and subscribe for more fascinating unsolved mysteries.